I came home to a blank wall where our 65-inch television used to be, and my husband was standing in the kitchen holding a dented multicooker with a piece of tape across the lid that read, "Carol's Handle with Care." He set it on the counter with a small, satisfied nod, as though he'd made a fair trade, as though the space where 4 months of my overtime had once hung was just a wall, just drywall and paint, and not the moment everything I thought I knew about my marriage began to unravel. He actually smiled. That's the part I still can't get out of my head when I replay it, even now, months later, sitting on my own porch with a coffee that nobody asked me to make. He set down his mother's battered old multicooker, the one she'd had since before I ever met Jason, the one with the scorch mark on the base and the plastic handle held together with electrical tape. And he looked at me with this expression of mild expectation, as if I were about to thank him. "Mom needed it more than us," he said, his voice carrying that flat certainty of a man who had already decided the argument was over before I walked in. And then, without missing a beat, "She sent this along. Could you make something decent tonight? She put a pork shoulder in the freezer for us." That was the sentence that broke something open inside me. Not the anger, not yet. What broke open was something quieter, like the first hairline crack in ice that runs all the way to the center before anyone hears the sound. Let me go back to the beginning. My name is Sarah. I was 34 years old when this happened, and I had been married to Jason for 6 years. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of a building I had spent 3 years saving for. Not we, I want to be precise, me. With a savings account I opened the summer after college and fed faithfully, $20 a week at first, then $50, then whatever remained after rent, groceries, and student loans. The apartment was registered in my name. I paid the larger share of the mortgage. Jason contributed reliably and without complaint, and I was grateful for that, but the foundation, the bedrock of it, was mine. That detail will matter. Every detail matters. Eventually. That is the cruelest thing about hindsight. It transforms every ordinary memory into evidence. We had a good life by most external measures. I worked as a financial analyst downtown. Long evenings in glass-walled conference rooms, fluorescent light, bad conference room coffee. Jason worked in logistics coordination, solid hours, home by 6 most evenings. We cooked on Sunday afternoons. We watched films on Friday nights with the good wine we'd stopped saving for a special occasion and just started opening. We argued about small things and made up quickly and fell asleep with the television on. The television, the one I bought in January standing in the electronics store for nearly an hour running numbers on my phone. I charged it to my personal card and paid it off over 4 months because I wanted to feel the pleasure of ownership without the edge of debt. I remember the evening it went up on the wall. Jason spent 40 minutes getting the bracket perfectly level, and I stood back watching with a warmth in my chest that felt entirely appropriate. The picture was extraordinary. The room felt different with it there, like a window that hadn't existed before. Jason's mother, Carol, came to dinner about 3 weeks after we installed it. She arrived at 7 precisely. Carol's punctuality was the kind that communicated control, not courtesy. She was 61, narrow-shouldered and trim, with silver hair and a careful cut, and a habit of tilting her head to the right when she was about to say something she wanted to sound gentle. She sat at the table with her back to the window and her face toward the screen, and I noticed during dinner the quality of her attention when her eyes moved toward it. Not admiration, assessment. The look you give something when you are calculating its weight and its mobility and its place in another room. "That is a very beautiful television," she said, tilting her head. "My old one has been giving trouble lately. The colors go strange." Jason said he would look into it. I smiled and refilled her wine. That was the first mistake. The smiling when I should have spoken. Carol had been, in the 6 years I'd known her, a presence requiring a particular kind of management. Not dramatic management, the daily, low-level kind that wears at you by repetition. She was not a villain in any simple sense. She was a woman who had raised her son alone after his father left when Jason was 9, and she had made that sacrifice the structural center of her identity. Every family gathering had a moment when the weight of what she had given was laid on the table, like a centerpiece. A sigh, a distant look, a quiet remark aimed at no one. I just sacrificed everything. For him. Jason would look at his plate. I would look at Jason. The silence between them was shaped over decades before I arrived, and I had learned to move around it carefully, the way you navigate furniture in a dark room you know by memory. The first real warning sign came 8 weeks before the television incident. I was in the kitchen finishing dinner prep, onions softening in the pan, the smell of garlic just beginning to bloom in the oil. And Jason was in the living room on his phone, using the lowered, deliberate voice he reserved for uncomfortable conversations. I caught fragments through the small apartment. "Well, not the right time, Mom," she'd notice. And, "She pays the mortgage. I can't just..." And then a long silence, and then, "Okay, I'll think about it." He came to dinner with the expression of a man who had agreed to something he hadn't finished justifying to himself. I asked who had called. He said Carol said she was having boiler trouble, might need help with repair costs. I said, of course, we could help with that. He nodded and changed the subject. I let him change it. I thought I had understood the conversation. I had understood almost nothing. There was another moment, smaller, 2 weeks after that. I came home to find Carol in our apartment. She had a spare key I'd agreed to copy 2 years into the marriage, which had seemed like the reasonable adult thing to do at the time. She was standing at the bookshelf when I walked in. She turned with that tilted head smile, said she'd stop by with soup, and yes, there was soup in a pot on the counter. She stayed 20 minutes, chatted, left. That evening, I noticed the small silver-framed anniversary photo on the second shelf had shifted 3 or 4 centimeters from where it always stood. I mentioned it to Jason. He said I was probably imagining it. Maybe I was. I told myself I was. But it sat in the back of my mind like a low-frequency hum. Present and sourceless, impossible to locate. The following Saturday, I had a half day at the office. I left at 8 while Jason was still warm and mostly asleep, pressed a quiet goodbye against his shoulder, and took my keys from the hook by the door. The morning was cold and clear, pale autumn blue, and I drove to the office thinking about a presentation, stopped at the grocery store on the way home for coffee, and let myself into the apartment at 12:47. Then I looked up. The wall was blank. I stood in the open doorway, 5 seconds, 6, staring at the bare plaster, the brackets still bolted there, the cables hanging loose like cut threads, the faint rectangular ghost on the paint where the screen had blocked the light for months. My grocery bag slid from my fingers and hit the entry floor, and I heard it land but didn't look at it. My first thought was not about Jason or Carol or theft or betrayal. My first thought was that someone had broken in. I checked the lock. The lock was fine. The door frame was undisturbed. My key had worked perfectly. Then I heard the coffee maker from the kitchen. Jason was standing at the counter in the same gray sweater he'd been sleeping in when I left, watching the coffee brew, entirely at ease. On the counter beside the machine sat the multicooker. Carol's tape dark against the gray plastic lid. He turned when he heard me, and his expression was the thing that stopped the air in my lungs. It was calm, unguarded, domestic, Saturday morning calm. "You're back early," he said. "Want a cup?" I pointed at the living room. He followed the line of my arm, looked at the wall, looked back at me. "Mom really needed it," he said. "Hers finally broke completely. We can watch things on the laptop for now. It's fine, Sarah. She sent this for us. It's practically new." He touched the multicooker lightly, presenting it as evidence of a fair exchange. "She'd like a sundae. If you do the pork shoulder tonight, we could bring something over." The floor did not move. The walls held. But there is a physical experience that accompanies a certain quality of shock, a cold wave from the sternum outward to the hands, a slight delay in how sound reaches the ears, a quality to the light, like a lens put fractionally out of focus. I gripped the kitchen door frame. My knuckles felt distant, like things I was observing from outside my own hands. I looked at the familiar slope of Jason's nose, the curl of his hair at the back of the neck. I looked at the multicooker on my counter, in my apartment, on my mortgage. And somewhere beneath the cold wave, beneath the fractured quiet of the moment, a voice said it plainly. "This is not the first thing. You have been losing pieces of your life one at a time, and you have been looking away from every single one." "Jason," I said. My voice was flat and strange, sanded down to just the syllables. "How did you get it to her apartment?" "Borrowed Mark's van," he said. "He helped carry it down." He had planned it, not impulsively. He had called a friend, arranged a vehicle, coordinated logistics, carried a 65-inch screen down 4 flights of stairs, and driven it across the city, while I sat in a conference room, trusting completely that my home was as I had left it. He had done it while I was earning the money that paid the mortgage on the apartment where the wall was now bare. He came back with a dented multi-cooker and a request for pork shoulder and a cup of coffee he was still trying to hand me. "When did you decide to do this?" I asked. He held the cup out toward me, a peace offering in ceramic, steam rising from it in a thin, patient column. And there was something in his eyes that I was only just beginning to read correctly. Not guilt, not shame. Something more careful than either of those. The navigating awareness of a man deciding how much of the truth is safe to give, and in what order, and how quickly he can restore the normal temperature of a room. "It's not a big deal," he said. "She needed it. We'll get another one." "With whose money, Jason?" His eyes found the kitchen floor. The chin dropped slightly. The gaze settled on a neutral point below the horizon of accountability. I had seen that look many times in 6 years and always read it as shame. The private embarrassment of a man who knew he'd overstepped. Standing in my kitchen with my hands cold and the wall behind me empty, I began to read it for the first time as what it actually was. Not shame, calculation. The look of a man who has been in this conversation before, in different forms with different stakes, and knows precisely how long to wait before the pressure eases. I should have left the kitchen then. I should have picked up my grocery bag from the entry floor, set the coffee down, sat somewhere quiet, and thought, but the part of me that had spent 6 years maintaining the peace, smoothing the air, choosing the winnable argument over the true one, that part was not yet finished. So I stood there, and I waited for some flicker of real accountability, some movement behind his eyes that would tell me this was a mistake he already understood was a mistake. I waited the way you wait in the seconds after dropping something fragile, before you look down, when it is still possible to hope the floor was kind. He sipped his coffee. He leaned against the counter. He looked almost relaxed. I looked at his mother's multi-cooker on my counter, and I thought about the boiler conversation I hadn't pushed, the shifted photograph I had decided not to examine, the key I had given in good faith, the way he had said we'll get another one as if the money to do so grew somewhere he didn't need to tend. Something in the room was different from every other Saturday we had stood in this kitchen. The temperature was exactly the same. The light was the same. Jason was in the same gray sweater. But something had changed in the air between us. Something subtle and permanent, a chemical alteration, the kind you only detect once it is already complete. For a long time after that Saturday, I would try to identify the single moment when I stopped being naive and started being dangerous. I think it was Sunday evening, sitting on the floor of our bedroom with Jason's laptop open in my lap and a legal document on the screen that had my name in the header and Carol's in the signature block. But first came the afternoon, and the afternoon was its own education. I set the untouched coffee cup down and walked back into the living room and stood in front of the empty wall. I stood there long enough that Jason appeared in the doorway behind me, watching me the way you watch a weather system that hasn't made up its mind. Then I looked around the rest of the room, and that was when I noticed the lamp. The floor lamp in the corner beside the bookshelf, brushed brass, linen shade, the one that turned the evenings warm and particular, was gone. Just a small clean circle on the carpet where the base had stood. I turned to Jason. "The lamp," I said. He took a long, slow sip of coffee. "Mom needed one for the reading chair," he said, in the tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone making an unnecessary fuss. "I brought it over last Tuesday." Last Tuesday, while I was at work, with the key she had, the key I had given in good faith. I sat down on the sofa, not because my legs gave out, but because they made a quiet decision, and I let them. I looked at the empty corner, the empty wall, the multi-cooker visible through the doorway, and I made a list in my head. The television. The lamp. Carol's visit to the bookshelf, the anniversary photo moved 3 centimeters. The boiler conversation I had never fully understood. The spare key. All of it lining up now in a new configuration, pointing in one direction. I thought, what else? And then, more precisely, how long? Jason sat beside me. He turned on the earnest, slightly boyish look he used when he wanted to explain his way into forgiveness. "I know it seems like a lot, but Mom's on a fixed income. She doesn't have what we have. We can replace a lamp." I looked at him. My face was very still. Something had changed in the way I was listening. A shift from the listening you do with someone you trust to the listening you do when you are collecting information. What else has she taken? The word taken landed between us, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I wouldn't use that word," he said quietly. "I gave it to her. There's a difference." I went to the bedroom. Jason's laptop was on the desk, screen in sleep mode. I touched the trackpad and the screen came to life. He hadn't closed the browser. There was a tab still open, an email addressed to R. Holt with the subject line, "Re-property amendment, additional party." I read it. Then I read it again. Then I read the entire thread going back 6 weeks. R. Holt was a solicitor. The emails discussed, in the calm procedural language of legal correspondence, the possibility of adding Carol's name to the title deed of our apartment, specifically as a life interest beneficiary, which would give her the legal right to remain in the property in the event of Jason's death, or, under certain provisions, in the event of the dissolution of our marriage. In Jason's most recent message, sent the same Thursday he had cooked pasta and held my hand over the table and told me he was proud of me, He had written, "She's agreed. I'll bring the documents for review this week. My wife doesn't need to be present for the preliminary consultation. My wife doesn't need to be present." My palms were flat on the cool desk surface. The room was very quiet. Outside somewhere, a car passed. I could hear Jason moving in the kitchen, every sound distinct and separate and very far away, as if I were listening from the bottom of still water. The apartment was registered in my name. Any amendment to the title deed required my signature, my legal presence, my explicit consent. What they had been planning for 6 weeks was not yet a crime, but it was a map, and a map reveals intent. I closed the laptop. I sat for 4 minutes, looking at nothing. Then I stood up, straightened my jacket, and went back to the kitchen. Jason was rinsing cups with the careful deliberateness of a man performing normality for an audience of 1. He turned when he heard me. I said, "Our Holt." His face went white. The blood left the skin visibly in half a second. He set the cup down with a small, precise click. "You went through my laptop," he said. His voice was very quiet. "You were planning to put your mother's name on my apartment," I said. "The apartment registered only in my name, that I made the down payment on. You have been in contact with a solicitor for 6 weeks without telling me." The silence in the kitchen was enormous. The refrigerator hummed. He said nothing. That silence was its own answer. Not the silence of innocence wrongly accused, not the shock of a misunderstanding. The silence of someone standing in water up to their chin, deciding which way to swim. After nearly a minute, he said, "I was going to tell you." I was going to, as if the telling were a courtesy he'd been planning to extend at a time of his choosing, from a position of established fact. "When?" I said. "After the documents were signed?" He flinched. "She asked me to do it," he said, and his voice had a quality I had never heard in it before. Thin and hollow, like a container something important had recently left. "She said if anything happened to me, you'd sell the place and she'd have nowhere. She said you never liked her. She said she'd been telling people in the family that you were unstable, that you'd been making her feel unwelcome." He said it not endorsing it, not refusing it either, reporting a view without owning one. The word unstable moved through me like a swallowed thing, cold and sharp. So that had been the strategy. The lamp, the television, the photograph moved 3 centimeters, pieces taken one by one, the accumulation of absence made manageable by a prior narrative about a wife who was difficult, emotional, unreliable, a woman whose name on a deed might not be dependable, a woman who might need to be managed around. "Did you believe that?" I asked. "Did you believe I was unstable?" He didn't answer. That was worse than any answer he could have given. I called my father that evening. He picked up on the second ring, the way he always does, as if he has been waiting for the call he knew would eventually come. He is a retired civil lawyer, 28 years in property and contract law, and he has a mind that is precise and patient and entirely unsentimental. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting and then said, "They cannot do it without your signature on a transfer instrument, and you will not sign one. Get a property lawyer Monday morning. Change the locks tonight. Document everything. Photograph every email, every text, every piece of paper." His voice was the steadiest thing I had touched in 8 hours. He added, "Were items removed from your sole ownership property that were purchased with personal or joint funds?" I said yes. He said, "Good. Keep that documented too." The locksmith came at 7 that evening, charged emergency weekend rates, and was worth every penny. Jason watched from the living room doorway without a word. When the job was done, I set the single new key on the kitchen counter and looked at Jason across the apartment. He had his hands in his pockets, and he looked smaller than he had that morning. Or perhaps I was simply seeing him at an accurate size for the first time. "Call your mother," I said. "The lamp and the television will be collected within the week. If they are not returned, I will file a report for theft of items removed from a property registered solely in my name." I paused. "I am calling a lawyer on Monday. Whatever R. Holt told you was possible, it isn't, and I want that in writing." He started to say my name. "No," I said. Quiet. Final. A door closing on a particular kind of conversation. Not tonight. On Monday, I was at a property solicitor's office by 9. A woman named Diane, recommended through my father's network, with a calm, organized intelligence that I found immediately reassuring. I spread everything across her desk: email screenshots, receipts for both items, photographs of the empty bracket and the bare carpet circle. She reviewed it for 12 minutes without speaking. Then she looked up. Nothing is legally actionable yet. They did not succeed in executing anything, but the intent is documented. My recommendation is a formal letter to your husband and to R. Holt, copied to Carol, stating your explicit awareness and your refusal to consent to any amendment of the title. I said, "Send it." She said she would have it drafted by morning. The letter went out Tuesday. R. Holt responded within 24 hours confirming the matter was closed on his end. Carol did not respond. The television and the lamp were returned on Thursday, carried up 4 flights of stairs by a silent and visibly diminished Jason. He set them down in the entry and stood there a moment. "She's very upset," he said. "She feels humiliated." I looked at the dust still on the lampshade. "Good," I said. It was the first honest thing I had said to him in days. The marriage did not survive the winter. I want to say that clearly, without drama. It simply didn't, and it shouldn't have. Jason and I separated in February. The process was quiet and legally uncomplicated because the apartment was mine and had always been mine. We split the shared accounts evenly and without argument. He moved across the city. I rekeyed the locks after he collected his things, had the wall bracket filled and repainted, and left the wall bare because I decided I preferred it that way. The clean plaster, the absence of something that had once felt like ours. What I felt in the months that followed, and this took me time to understand and then time to trust, was space. Not loneliness, not the particular grief of a marriage's ending, but something closer to the first deep breath after a long time underwater. I moved the bookshelf. I planted something small on the kitchen windowsill, an herb. Nothing ambitious, just something green and alive that needed daily care and gave something back. On evenings I came home from the office to my quiet apartment. I would stand in the kitchen in the last of the light and feel the specific warmth of rooms that belong to you entirely. Rooms that hold no ongoing negotiation, no managed silence, no fear of what has been rearranged while your back was turned. I told my father the full story one Sunday afternoon in March, sitting on his back terrace with the early spring light coming low and gold through the bare trees. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, then said, "The mistake you made was deciding that keeping the peace was the same as making peace." He picked up his coffee. "They're not the same thing. One is an avoidance. The other is an act." I thought about that for a long time on the drive home. I thought about the smile Jason had been wearing when I came through the door that Saturday, the multicooker on my counter, the pork shoulder in the freezer I'd never cooked. I thought about the wall in my living room, blank and repainted and entirely mine. Some things, once you see them clearly, cannot be made blurry again. You cannot unknow the shape of what was being built in the quiet while you were looking away. You can only decide, finally, without negotiation, without apology, what belongs to you, and hold that line not with anger, which exhausts itself, but with something quieter and more permanent, certainty, the kind that needs no witness, asks no permission, and does not, under any circumstances, cook the pork shoulder.